One of the first things people associate with Israel is its military. How has Israel managed to survive despite being at war for every day of its existence? Regardless of whichever side one takes in the Israeli-Arab conflict, the fact remains that Israel is a fortress besieged. It is a small country surrounded by a number of larger hostile neighbors. One reason behind Israel's continued survival lies in its military strength. However, the Israel Defense Forces have not always been the small but potent force we know them as today. In order to understand how the IDF evolved into such an effective force, we must go back to the roots of the pre-state Jewish military traditions. At the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish self-defense militias were formed in Ottoman Palestine, which was actually part of Ottoman Syria. Due to ongoing persecution in the Russian Empire in the latter half of the 19th century, an influx of Jewish immigrants arrived in the area to join the Jewish community that was already living there. This persecution, combined with anti-Semitic sentiment in Western Europe, would culminate in the Zionist movement. Hostility toward Jews in Europe and in Palestine would breed a new type of Jew, what Max Nordau dubbed as the Muscular Jew. The earliest Jewish militias in Palestine were Bar Giora and Hashomer. The latter began as an offshoot of the former. Hashomer was a secretive and elitist organization. In 1920, Hashomer was disbanded. Perhaps their best-known action was their failed defense of the settlement of Tel Hai under the leadership of Joseph Trumpeldor. For all practical purposes, Hashomer was little more than an armed gang, but the precedent had been set for a Jewish self-defense force. After the disbanding of Hashomer, the Haganah was founded. The Haganah was a more populist armed group open to any able-bodied member of the Jewish community in Palestine. Within the Haganah were the elite Palmach, or striking force units. During the Allied invasion of Lebanon and Syria in 1941, Palmach units moved ahead of the main invasion force and sabotaged Vichy French targets. It was during this operation that future Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan lost his eye. The Palmach was known for its lack of discipline and lack of a rigid hierarchy. This military tradition would clash with the British tradition that some Jews had adopted while serving in the British military during World War II. Eventually, however, the Palmach's way of doing things became the norm. Even in the IDF today, there is less emphasis on formal training and discipline and more on practical matters and practical combat experience. Indeed, the majority of the Haganah's leadership had no experience in commanding units beyond company level. Another consequence of this is that officers in the IDF tend to be younger on average than officers in other countries' militaries. For example, Moshe Dayan rose to the position of IDF Chief of Staff at the age of 37. British Army officer Ord Wingate arrived in Palestine in the late 1930s to work with and train the Haganah. Under Wingate, the Special Night Squads were established. The Special Night Squads will be made up of British infantrymen and Haganah members. Moshe Dayan and Yigal Allon would both serve under Wingate. Ord Wingate's doctrine of moving and operating at night would become a part of the later Israel Defense Forces doctrine. The technical creativity of the Jewish community in Palestine would also work in their favor. In all of Israel's wars, the Israelis maintained a technological advantage over their enemies. Even during the period of the British Mandate, the Jews maintained underground weapons factories and workshops. Since Israel's foreign arms supply was always in danger of being cut off, Israel resorted to developing its own indigenous arms industry. Some notable Israeli weapons include the Merkava tank and the Uzi submachine gun. Israel managed to defeat the Arabs in 4 wars between 1948 and 1973 for several reasons. First was the disunity of the Arab armies. Second, the Arab forces were poorly led compared to the Israelis. Third, the Israelis possessed a technological advantage. With American military aid and continued Israeli innovation, the IDF has always maintained this technological edge. Israel, having been at war for every day of its existence, has been able to mobilize its society and economy for war in ways that many other democratic countries cannot. For instance, the Israeli press is subject to censorship when covering certain topics, such as national security issues. Israel's system of conscription and mandatory service in the reserves ensures that there is always a pool of personnel available for service, too. Being a nation surrounded by larger enemies has made Israel a military power out of necessity. However, Israel's victories on the field of battle have only endangered her even more. The ongoing security issues in the territories occupied in 1967 demonstrate this. Still, Israel has managed to use its military power to ensure its national survival. Thanks for watching and see you next time.